Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
And welcome to all of you. October 16, a Monday, 2023. In these horrific times, we are lucky to have with us this morning somebody who has spent a lifetime trying to understand the part of the world that holds our attention right now, the Middle East. Micheline Ishay is a professor of international studies and human rights at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She has taught at universities in the Middle East, and she has, as I suggested, spent much of her life trying to understand this extraordinary part of the world. Welcome to the program. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Pleasure to be there.
I've been wondering. I mean, I am so ripped apart by these events that have occurred and are occurring and will occur, and I can't imagine somebody like you, with all of the knowledge in your head of how we got to this point. And you have to look at it with the, I suppose, dispassion of an academic, and yet you're a person. Can you be dispassionate about what is happening there?
I hope so. That's a professional deformation. We learn to dissociate ourselves from emotional issue in order to inform and educate. So with respect to the question you were asking, what happened there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we know
what
that
happened there?
Okay, so we know that our main protagonists in this conflict, so far, Hamas and Israel. Hamas relies heavily on support from Iran. Hezbollah is also an Islamist party in Lebanon, which is the proxy of Iran and has joined the attack by shelling northern Israel. But the sporadic exchange of fire there have not, as so far, to a second front in the war. So additionally, we see also that Israel and Egypt have sealed their borders with Gaza. And at this point, there appears to be little risk of further incursions from Gaza into Israel. So there's most of the... go ahead.
No. Well, there's so many questions. So the sealed border with Egypt is really something that I find incomprehensible. I mean, these people, the Gazans, are told to get out, and yet the way out is blocked. And you have the United States actively trying to get, diplomatically to get that open. And everything I read suggests that nobody quite understands why it won't open. Is it Israel that's keeping it closed, or the Egyptians?
Well, probably initially a combination of both. It's true that over 1 million of Gazans in the north have been told that they should evacuate to the south because of the incoming ground invasions of Israeli into Gaza. The Rafah crossing, which is the southern crossing of Gaza, is currently sealed for two reasons. First, it is true that there is a fear that Hamas militants will be leaving to Egypt. So the Egyptians are concerned about that. They're certainly concerned that there will be humanitarian catastrophe, and in addition, Hamas militants moving to the Sinai Desert. So they are reluctant. And at the same time, the United States is attempting to alleviate the burden and the plight of the Gazan citizens by pressuring Egypt to open the borders. And I believe that will probably happen in tandem with Israel. Nobody's briefing me as to when and when those things will happen, but I'm quite sure that some form of a medical humanitarian assistance will happen in the next few days.
I mean, we see pictures of these, lines and lines of trucks filled with aid, waiting to get in, and and knowing that the people in Gaza need so much food, literally food, water, medical supplies. I guess Israel might be concerned about what's in all those trucks, and I mean, you see how complicated this is.
Yes, Israel is very concerned about what's in the truck. The Egyptians are concerned what is in the truck. They want to be mediator, ultimately, between Hamas and Israel. They like that mediating posturing, and they've done it in the past. So I think that there is an effort by the Gulf countries, Israel and Egypt, to de-escalate. It's unclear to what extent the Israeli will undertake that invasion and for how long. There's also pressures within the Israeli government and among people who are no longer in the government, such as former Prime Minister and Chief of Staff Ehud Barak, to have a much not to have such a merciless attack in Gaza. So the jury is still out as to what will happen.
I was thinking, it's just a fantasy of mine, that it would seem that Hamas knew full well when they did what they did, what the Israeli response would be. I mean, they knew that this would, mean an invasion of Gaza. So in that respect, it almost seems like a suicide mission on their part. But is Israel playing right into their hands if that is, in fact, what Hamas wants? They want this invasion to make Israel look like the aggressor.
Possibly, that's possibly one of the scenarios, but one has to remember that about 199 as of today, Israeli have been kidnapped, and many more thousands of Palestinians are in Israeli prisons. They want an exchange between those Palestinian prisoners and close to 200 people who have been kidnapped. That is very high on their list of requests and demands. They feel that they have been left from all the normalization processes between Israel and the Gulf country following the Abraham Peace Accord, which normalized Israel relationship first with the United Arab Emirates, then Bahrain, then with Morocco, and then Sudan. The Palestinian questions have been left out, and many Palestinians have lived in periods of great economic duress, and also, in my opinion, are very well represented by Hamas since 2006, because there have not been any elections since 2006.
Is it true that Hamas, I have heard people say that you can be pro-Palestinian and you can be pro-Hamas, but you cannot be both? The idea being that Hamas really is not good for the Palestinian cause. Well,
if Hamas is a group that attempts to promote the rights of Palestinians, it has a very bad track record. Human Rights Report has indicated, very critical to Israel as well, has also indicated that it's a government that tends to do arbitrary detention, incarceration, torture its own people, not very well known for its women's rights issue, actually on the contrary. And so it's not the best agency for human rights. And they have not been voted into power since 2006, which means 17 years ago. So we do not know the level of legitimacy. Today, they probably are legitimate because under fire, any group gets legitimacy. But generally speaking, I would say that as of October, if you were thinking about October 2005 of the last week, many Palestinians would have said in the street, in some survey where they would have felt unidentified, that they did not support Hamas. So a lot of distrust about that regime, that government, what it's able to accomplish, its mission and its lack of representation. So yes, you can be pro-Palestinians and not for Hamas. Some people would suggest that in the void of representation, Hamas and even the PLO is all what they have left with. So that argument is also been aired as well.
In Israel, Netanyahu has got this will, I would think, when the dust settles, be the end of him. Would you agree?
Many people argue the same way. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of people are reminding themselves of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israel was also surprisingly attacked by two Arab states. Despite the victory of Israel at the end of the war, the government of Golda Meir failed. She was voted out of confidence. There will be, just as the same way as happened after the Yom Kippur War and many other wars, there will be investigation as to the failure of the intelligence, the deployment of military in the West Bank rather than on the Gaza Strip. There will be a lot of questions about that government and its ability to protect its people. There's also a lot of anger against the government, as you know, since Netanyahu has been elected to power and formed a very right-wing government. Israeli protesters went on the street week after week, unrelentlessly, and with the greatest mass of protests that the country has seen, because that government wanted the overhaul of the judicial system. So a lot of anger that preceded the war. Now with a war that has begun with a lot of failed intelligence, there will be probably, it will be very difficult for him to sustain power after that.
I would imagine so. And it seems to me that his sole objective in the last, year, has been his own survival, more so than Israel's survival. And he has caused I've never seen such division in Israel itself. Astonishingly now, Israel is more together because of the Hamas invasion. But this ultimately, I would think, would not be good for the coalition that enabled Netanyahu most recently, the far-right coalition. I'm hoping this is not good for them.
You're correct. Benjamin Netanyahu has been very much focused on its own political survival, but he has in government groups that are religious zealots and messianic who wishes to change some of the secular law into more rabbinical law and to annex the West Bank. That is actually the result of a very long history of the right wing or the ultra right wing to gain stronghold in politics when secular and more liberal forces were looking the other way. So that government is not completely a surprise if people were paying attention to what led to that government. I think that a lot of people were not paying attention. And so to your questions, will that government create its own demise? I think that certainly now in terms of the war, they will. I was suspecting that it would have happened even before because we had different sections of the society which are so instrumental in the economic activity and the livelihood of society, which were going against this government, notably some part of the military, the Air Force reservists did not wish to serve. Some of the reservists, including reservists of the intelligence, refused to serve. So we had really that sector plus the economic sector, the high-tech sectors, which was really on the side of the protest movement, was really another reason to think that that country was not going to be able to sustain itself as it used to be under that particular coalition. So even before the war, I was sort of betting that it would not be long lasting. Now with the war, I'm thinking that will be very difficult.
What do you? I mean, I don't know how people have much hope. I remember when finally in Ireland that constant war was, there was a peace in Ireland. I thought, my God, well, maybe it's possible after years and years and years that peace comes to a place where you cannot even envision it anymore. Would you agree that both the Palestinians and the Israelis, these two great peoples who both know dispossession of their homeland, doesn't it make, and they both have claim, without a doubt, claim to that same dusty sliver of land. So it is only a two-state solution that can be the end result, but that seems farther away than it has ever been. How do you, in your fantasies, how do you see this ending well?
It is difficult to talk about ending well in the midst of war time, but here is a couple of things that we know historically. During the first war in Lebanon, we know that the Israeli defeated the PLO, at least the military wing of the PLO, which had to find refuge in Tunisia. After the first Intifada, which was really the result of Palestinians in the West Bank, the PLO was reinvited and signed the peace agreement, the Oslo agreement with Israeli in 1987. There was a moment in which, as a result of the surrendering of violence, the PLO was reinvited on the negotiating table. There's a lot of lessons to be learned about what not to do with respect to when it comes to the Oslo agreement. But one would hope that if the military wing of Hamas was sufficiently debilitated or neutralized, I'm not talking about the political wing, but certainly the military wing, perhaps there will be possibility for them to come back to a negotiating table down the road, not right away for sure. And maybe Palestinians will be able to elect governments that are more democratically representative and also wanted to promote democracy, not just mechanic or procedural democracy. So this is just hope, wishful thinking. It's unclear whether that will happen. I always tend to think that there's a lot, as you say, a lot of creativity in that part of the world, and it's very sad to see that it's not being used to the better end of peace. But, I am an historian as well, and I look at period in history when Europe was afflicted by two world wars, and the last Second World War took about 80 million people. And thereafter, there were, thanks to the genius of people like Roosevelt, the infrastructures of peace were developed. And so Europe did not suffer to the same level of world wars and the scale of war. So with that in mind, I always hope that when people will move beyond their grief, they will be able to have visionary to think about what are the best infrastructures for sustainable peace process that goes beyond what the Oslo Agreement was.
You mentioned Roosevelt. I mean, there are times in history when great men, capable men, leaders arise. That has not been, it seems like any time a leader in the Middle East has arisen attempting to head for a peaceful solution, they're murdered by their own. Rabin was taken out by a fellow Israeli, Sadat, killed by Egyptians.
Yes, you're correct. But in the various peace, even the Camp David 1, and then even Camp David 2, which was more of a failure, there was always a third party, and it is important that the international community bridge those gaps, this enormous gap that currently exists. We have, interestingly enough, an Arab peace accord, which in a way is stabilizing the region. The Iranian, of course, very fearful of that, but it has done well in one way by just creating a peace process. The problem of those agreements is that it failed to address the Palestinian question, which is now has proved to be explosive. So going back to your questions about the great peoples who have the capacity to do that, we have also a better Middle East in certain way, worse in other way, better from Israel to the Gulf minus Iran, worse with respect to Israeli and the Palestinians. So mitigating forces, international community will need to intervene to create those frameworks. I don't think the Israeli and the Palestinians will be able to do that alone.
Where do you get info? There is so much disinformation out now, and I would think that that ability to disinform, have viral videos go out that are not true, really stands in the way of peacemakers now.
Well, they're not currently yet peacemakers. There are people who are trying to de-escalate the situations. Where I get my information, I usually try to review presses, different presses, Israeli presses, American presses, European presses, and some of the Arab press. And then I just figure out what is the common denominators among the more authoritative ones. And then I look at the critique of each of those presses. So I do go through a wide ranges of statements in order to from different authority. I checked. I do as much as one can do in that profession to make sure that I get the most accurate knowledge. I think far from it. In time of war, there's a lot of unclear information.
Yeah. Who would you recommend that regular, ordinary folks like us, where would we, if we want to seek out authoritative information from, let's say, Israel and or Egypt and or Gaza? Are there places that you generally trust as news operations?
Oh, there's a great number, including the critique of Israel. I would just make them as part of it, or the critiques of the Palestinians. So Le Monde, Washington Post, New York Times, Haaretz, Al Jazeera, Jordanian News, a number of different outlets from different places would be the one I would trust to give at least one side of the story that might be interesting to review.
Any particular Israeli newspaper?
It's very difficult in Israel because in time of war, the Israeli actually censor a lot of the military actions, and often Israeli go to the European press or the foreign press.
Huh.
So I tend, particularly on the so Haaretz is usually an easy paper that people can read because it's in English. It's a more liberal press. Other people can try the Jerusalem Post, a bit more mainstream conservative. Then, of course, in the United States, you can the New York Times, always famously Washington Post, more liberal, but one can go to the more conservative press if needed. Even in Financial Times, The Economist, very good articles coming out. Le Monde Diplomatique, always a very good source, critical sometimes of Israel, but has been also arguing against Hamas. So a variety of presses that provide some fact that seems to be the same. And so I retain what is the same, the common denominators.
So you're saying that if we want to know what's going on, we've got to do work like you do work. You take in a lot of sources and then you use your own head to see where it appears there are
pretty much
places of agree. Yeah.
Pretty much, and also asking the tough questions as to the motivations of why people do what they do, their end goal, what people gained in the process, the cost of certain actions. So those questions remain very important in the process of reviewing those outlets.
Okay. Well, we all sit here now waiting with dread for the Israelis to go in to Gaza. You have any sense of when that will happen?
No, unfortunately, I don't. It's I know that the Israeli have said in the press, that they were giving the Palestinians 24 hours to evacuate. Under pressure, they have provided a little bit more. I think that it's probably imminent, but there is an understanding that there is also a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and so how to do it properly would be difficult. I'm not privy to any of those information from the Israeli military. It seems to me, however, that it's clear that the target is the Hamas military wing. Very difficult to see how they're going to do, because it will be a urban warfare with tunnels and explosive and terrain that Israeli knows less than the Hamas militants, and so I do not know. I think there's a lot of preparation and questions as to what, where, when, even on the Israeli military side. Difficulty on the Gaza side, for sure, with respect to the innocent populations trying to find a refuge. So it's negotiating. With respect to intelligence, I don't know exactly. I would say this week, sometime, anytime from today to the next few days.
Okay, so nobody knows. But do you think the voices calling for restraint, like you mentioned, Ahu Barak, and others, have any chance in Israel now with the military and with the government?
Probably, because there is a sense of military cost as well, not just the cost of the Palestinian people. When you send, when Israeli sends those soldiers on difficult terrain, a lot of Israeli soldiers are going to be dying in that war. And then so there is a lot of pressure within Israel to release the hostages first, because there's a fear that if there is an invasion on the ground, that will alter the possibility for an exchange of prisoners with those hostages and hostages. So I think that there is restraint within Israeli because of those fears as well, even among the military. I think that the rhetoric of war is one thing, and what is happening in war rooms is slightly different.
Yes. Well, that certainly is. Yeah, that is a good point and a good thing for us to remember. Well, I don't know. You're going to be the dispassionate academic. I'll be here despairing. Okay, I mean, I feel there's so much despair among the Jewish population in this country, and it's hard not to despair.
Of course, it is very hard, because as by October 6th, just before the war, October 5th, for the first time, there were a lot of people on the streets very aware about what could be a more illiberal authoritarian government. And many, as a result of that, found their fate closer to the Palestinian cause. There was effort to consider those issues that were put on the sideline, and that all possibility of peace talk during the time has reached a real setback. So there are reasons for despair, for sure, certainly on the Israeli side, but also on the Palestinian side. The ravage of war take a lot of time to reconstruct the dike of peace, and I have no idea how long that will take. So I understand this is a very real emotion. What we have seen also on the news on the Israeli side has been horrific. Israeli have been reminded by the recent attack of images that they once upon a time only saw during World War II, pogrom images that are reminiscent of the pogrom, images that are reminiscent of the Holocaust, and that is really and also images are reminiscent of the Yom Kippur War. So that triggered really collective trauma on the side of the Israeli. But on the side of the Palestinian, we have also a similar collective historical trauma. There's been tragic war for them with the Israeli neighbor. Those wars have rekindled the collective trauma of Israel 1948 War of Independence, which they called the catastrophe, the Nakba. And the recent attack by Hamas in Israel unfolding retaliation is a reminder that for Palestinians, that the retaliation that is ongoing is one more retaliation of the Israeli that will cost a great number of casualties that would far exceed Israeli loss. And it also would remind them that throughout the Palestinian territory, that dislocation, restricted movement, checkpoints, random stopped, have interrupted daily routine, and that has also lingered their own continued trauma. So two countries very traumatized, two sides very traumatized, and that would create, for sure, a lot of need. A new narrative would be needed. A new shift of paradigm is desperately needed.
Wow!
Because right now, as we see, moderates on both sides are losing hope.
Oh boy! Well, I can't thank you.
I didn't want to leave you with the. I didn't.
No, it's okay.
Leave you the despair.
My despair is very stubborn at the moment, and but listen. I thank you so much for the work you do. I'm sure you're very busy these days, and I wish you all the best. And again, thank you for spending this time with us.
It was my pleasure, Lynn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Micheline. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, yes, Micheline Ishay, who, oh God, studies this. There is so much being written, and I've just been poring over so many pieces of thoughtful, I think, since the initial horror, it seems that more and more thoughtful pieces are being written. But my dread now is, Thomas Friedman put it pretty well when he said that what Hamas did to start this was insanity, was crazed and crazy. And he suggests they did it knowing it was crazy and forcing, they hoped, Israel to respond in kind, to out crazy them. And when passions run so high, it's hard for, and we've talked about this, but the brain, it's hard for the human brain to access its more rational parts. And so violence begets violence. I thought, and if you will allow, I thought that one piece I read by a man who is somebody who annoys a lot of Jews. He is a Jew himself. He annoys Jews because he has, for a long time, been a voice for the Palestinian cause, and for the necessity of a two-state solution, of a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. His name is Peter Beinart. There have been times when he has angered me. There are times when I think he is a voice of reason. I think he's done, and if you have access to it, he wrote a rather long piece in the New York Times yesterday, Sunday Times, that's headlined "The Work of Moral Rebuilding Must Begin Now." And I found it really compelling, difficult to read, and compelling. In part, he says that Hamas has committed an unspeakable horror that may damage the Palestinian cause for decades to come. And this is why I say you cannot, if you're pro-Palestinian, I'm pro-human. That's what I am here. If you are pro-Palestinian, you are not going to back Hamas. They have set back the Palestinian cause by this. But then Beinart says, but when Palestinians have tried to use nonviolent means to fight their oppression, calling for boycotts against Israel, sanctions against Israel, the same kinds of things that were done in regard to South Africa. He says the United States actively works against it. American Jews in general work against it. And he says, and what that has done is convince many Palestinians that nonviolent forms of resistance, boycott, sanctions, that kind of thing, well, that they don't work. And so he argues, and I think it's a compelling argument, and I have been against, I'm one of the Jews who was against the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction of Israel. But he says that was a nonviolent effort on the part of the Palestinian people to be heard. And they were shown that that wasn't going to fly. And yet, so they go back to violence, and yet, he says, the savagery that Hamas committed on October 7 has made reversing this monstrous cycle much harder. He says it'll take a generation. He quotes the literary critic, now deceased, Edward Said, who was extremely pro-Palestinian. He quotes him as saying this. He was trying to tell those who are pro-Palestinian this. He said Israeli Jews are something other than colonizers. What the left here, that has angered me so, when they call the Israelis colonizers, even Edward Said said that's really not the case. That gets you nowhere. They cannot be terrorized into fleeing their land. And he acknowledged that Israel, first of all, is too militarily powerful to be conquered. So if that is something that is understood, then again, violence is futile. And he pointed out that more fundamentally, Israelis, the Jews in Israel, have no home country to return to. They are already home. So there's the problem. The Israelis are home. The Palestinians were home violence is not going to resolve this. And then Beinart, who has been so much of a voice for Israeli restraint and stopping the repression of Palestinians. He said there are many Jews willing to join Palestinians in a movement to end what he calls this apartheid, even if doing so alienates us from our communities and in some cases our families. But, he says, we will not lock arms with people who cheer the kidnapping or murder of Jewish children. So these are, again, here is somebody who has worked tirelessly for peace and the Palestinians, and he sees only horror in what has happened and creating of even more difficulty for the Palestinians. Hamas has done a terrible thing to the Palestinians. I'll quote just a few more things that he said in ending his piece. Never in my lifetime, he wrote, have the prospects for justice and peace looked more remote. Yet the work of moral rebuilding must begin. In Israel and Palestine and around the world, pockets of Palestinians and Jews, aided by people of conscience of all backgrounds, must slowly construct networks of trust based on the simple principle that the lives of both Palestinians and Jews are precious and inextricably intertwined. And it's hard to argue that that is not what must happen. Palestinians and Jews of good conscience all around the world need to come together. And that will leave out a lot of those who say they are pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, but whose actions only and consistently work to divide Israeli from Israeli, Palestinian from Palestinian, Palestinians from Israeli, to create division, and who only see violence, the wiping out of Israel. Get real. As Edward Said said, those Jews are going nowhere. They are home. People of good conscience, not the bomb throwers, not the name callers, not the people who want to see things as evil and good, people who are capable of seeing the complexity here, but also the common humanity. He says this, American Jews who rightly hate Hamas, but know in their bones that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is profoundly wrong, must ask themselves a painful question. What nonviolent forms of Palestinian resistance would I support. And more Palestinians and their supporters must express revulsion in the murder of innocent Jews and affirm that Palestinian liberation means living equally alongside Jews in safety and freedom. And he ends with this. And perhaps one day, when it finally becomes hideously clear that Hamas cannot free Palestinians by murdering children, and Israel cannot subdue Gaza even by razing it to the ground, those communities of like-minded, peace-seeking people may become the germ of a mass movement for freedom that can astonish the world, as Black and white South Africans did decades ago. He writes, "I'm confident I will not live to see it. No gambler would stake a bet on it happening at all. But what's the alternative? For those of us whose lives and histories are bound up with that small, ghastly sacred, like many others who care about the lives of both Palestinians and Jews, I have felt in recent days the greatest despair I have ever known. A Palestinian friend sent me a note of consolation. She ended it with the words, 'Only together.' Maybe that can be our motto." Roger writes, watching news this morning, retired General Petraeus said that the ultimate question isn't how to successfully take control of Palestine and Hamas, but what is called phase 4, what happens after a successful invasion. It seems bizarre to talk about a successful invasion when you think of the death. And make no mistake, an awful lot of Israelis are going to die too. Like a suicide mission. He was told by Bush that there was a plan after successfully invading Afghanistan and Iraq, but there was not. And more enemies were created. Israel will be successful. What? Question, what does that mean? Shouldn't there be immediate, you wanted me to ask her, I'm sorry. Should every rich country participate in providing this aid? Obviously, there should be humanitarian, he ends with, at some point, revenge and hate must be turned down and eventually off, or war will always be forever. Well, unfortunately, human history shows us that humans aren't good at turning down the emotion. Humans all too easily understand revenge. And that revenge is what is driving this and always has. As I said, I am despairing. Okay. It's going to be very hard to get away from this, guys, seeing as the program is news centered. And I despair. If I use that word one more time, somebody put me out of my misery. I despair. Alexandra Petrie, not sure how she pronounces it, wrote a brilliant bit. I don't know if it can be read out loud to you, but it's great. And it's more a reading thing. I think you have to see it, but I can try. It almost sounded at first like it was an Onion, piece, because it's wonderful. It starts thusly: the word "but" has been stunned to find itself appearing in an increasing number of sentences. Sentences that begin like, "The killing of children is never acceptable. But." She writes, after finding itself in yet another Instagram comment preceded by the phrases, "I am devastated to read about the loss of life, but," and "I deplore the killing of civilians, especially children, but." The word "but" described itself as horrified to be included. Although it did not specify what sentiment came after it, possibilities included the phrases, "but, they should have had different parents," or references to making omelets makes you have to break eggs, but took to social media to beseech other posters to avoid making this mistake. But begged that those phrases be added to the list of sentences in which it would not appear under any circumstances. A list that already includes, "You never have to compliment Stalin for any reason." But I don't want to suggest that slavery wasn't an unmitigated evil. And genocide is always bad. The words "nonetheless," however, and "still" jointly concurred in Butt's statement, though nevertheless looked visibly tired and strained. Their statement read, "I am against the killing of children regardless of who their parents are or where they live," is a set of words that should never be accompanied by any of us. If you notice that you are putting us in, please, we beg you to reconsider. But also ask to be left out of sentences that start with, "Of course I condemn the deaths of innocent civilians," and especially ask to be left out of, "I object to war crimes." "I believe in the inherent dignity of human life" is a sentence that is getting along just fine without me. Observed, but a sentiment with which nevertheless said it concurred 1,000 times. And in a separate statement, the noun "collateral damage" and the adjective "inevitable" asked to stop being forced to appear together. But concluded its statement by saying it would return to anxiously watching someone compose a post that began, "There is no excuse for anti-Semitism," and praying not to be called into service. I think that's one of the better pieces I've ever read on equivocation. And once you've read that or heard it now, listen to how many times that poor word, I now have such empathy for but, or nevertheless, or still, or however. Be wary of those who start with an unassailable statement. That gives them cover, you understand? And then they start whittling away at it. There is never any excuse for the killing of children. But, you know, as soon as that but comes in, you know that whoever is talking does not believe the first part of the sentence. Doesn't believe it. They say it, as I said, gives you cover, and then proceeds to rip it apart. I mean, an awful lot of other stuff is happening, guys, but geez. I want to say I stand with Senator Fetterman in saying that Senator Menendez should resign immediately and or be thrown out of the U.S. Senate. The more you read about what he and his wife have done, the more sickening it is. There is no way that guy should be in the Senate. And yes, that would do in our Senate majority. But he was literally a foreign agent for the Egyptians, or his wife certainly was. I cannot wait. I cannot wait for I'm sorry, I just heard from Micheline and I was trying to read at the same time. I mean, she's just doing interviews she's everywhere. She has taught in Israel. She has taught in Abu Dhabi. She has been she's recognized. She has been with the what is it? The Middle East Center for the Center for Middle East Studies, which just does incredible work. But that's I don't know. The only good thing that's going to come, I think, of this is, I mean, the only thing I can find now to say thank God is Netanyahu's done. He's done. Where did I see? I think it might have been in that the Friedman piece. He talks about in Israel there is volcanic anger at Netanyahu for the way he divided the country before this war. And in that division, probably, caused people to be caught napping. And let's not even get into his, his coalition government, which is creating more and more difficulty in this with the Palestinians by building more and more settlements in the West Bank, making it harder and harder to reach agreement in the future. And one of the members of his cabinet a woman named Edith Silman. She went to one of the Israeli hospitals to visit some of the wounded. And there's a video, a real video, not a doctored video, that's online that has her being essentially thrown out by a doctor who is raging at her as a representative of Netanyahu's government. The doctor is screaming, "You've ruined this country. Get out of here. How are you not ashamed?" And then you can hear him screaming, "It's our turn now. We are in charge. We will govern here. Right, left, a nation, united. Without you, you have ruined everything." There's the only good news. Okay, that's it for me, guys. Thank you so much for being there, if you are, and I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.